года было дикостью предположить, что украинская авиация будет бомбить города.
Залп сделал, изверг.
Антитерористична операція не може і не буде тривати 2-3 місяці.
Говорят, что здесь одни террористы. Какие террористы?
There is a strong pressure on NATO to get involved in this conflict in a more active way. Something more than just supplying weapons to Ukraine and sharing intelligence information with the Ukrainian authorities. For instance, there is a discussion about a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and if NATO tries to have such a no-fly zone, it will constitute a danger of a direct NATO-Russia conflict, and this conflict, unfortunately, can easily escalate to the nuclear level.
Просила на коленях с племянником с подвала. Спасите нас, выведите людей, потом, пожалуйста, стреляйте.
After yesterday's failed evacuation from southeastern Ukraine, many were left devastated, blaming Ukrainian forces. Only 300 civilians managed to leave today, with the ceasefire allegedly being violated.
All over the place. Our personal documents, IDs of Ukrainian troops, military uniforms. Apparently the soldiers here shook off these, left them here, and put on civilian clothing before mingling with civilians.
In a chaotic retreat from their bases, Ukrainian servicemen leave vast amounts of equipment behind as they flee Russia's offensive. Vladimir Putin says Russia's offensive in Ukraine will end as soon as Kiev is ready to stop fighting. That's as the Ukrainian president asks NATO countries to impose a no-fly zone and provide combat aircraft, something the West isn't prepared to do. And Russian-speaking Germans protest in Berlin against an increase in discrimination since the situation began in Ukraine. We spoke to one medical clinic owner who received an email from a Munich clinic saying it would no longer treat Russian-speaking patients. You're watching RT International. My name is Peter Scott, and wherever you're joining us from, welcome to 30 minutes of news and analysis. Now, with the conflict in Ukraine entering its 11th day, let's take a quick look at some of the latest developments. NATO weaponry and ammunition have fallen into Russian hands after being abandoned by retreating Ukrainian troops. Canada has refused to send fighter jets to Ukraine, citing the lack of training by local pilots to fly them. That's as Kiev demands more military supplies from Washington and more sanctions against Moscow. And speaking of which, Visa and MasterCard have suspended their operations in Russia in the latest pullout of Western companies. Also, a serious stalemate is occurring in several besieged cities. Kiev accuses Russia of indiscriminate shelling, but Moscow claims Ukrainian far-right forces are using civilians as human shields and not allowing them to leave through humanitarian corridors. And talking of which, humanitarian corridors in Ukraine have again been opened today. That's according to Donbass officials. This video allegedly shows buses heading from the western city of Zaporozhye to Mariupol to take part in the evacuation. Donetsk authorities claim around 300 people were evacuated, and that's before both sides blamed each other for a violation of the ceasefire. Yesterday's safe exit routes were closed for the same reason, leaving those who hope to flee devastated.
просила на коленях с племянником с подвала. Спасите нас.
У меня вот 2 ребенка 10 дней в подвале. И почему наши власти, которым нужны люди,
Сами.
элементарный коридор, выведите людей, потом, пожалуйста, стреляйте. Я понимаю, это война.
Люди просили, дайте нам коридор, выехать отсюда. Они своих родственников вывезли, а мы остались.
У нас нет интернета. Откуда мы знаем, есть коридор или нет? Они же могли как-то договориться с громкоговорителями, брать, люди, выходите, у вас там 2 часа времени, текайте. Этого же не было. Мы хотим выйти, мы не хотели здесь сидеть в подвале. Мы хотим тоже жить спокойно.
Meanwhile, in other parts of Ukraine, fighting is ongoing. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, Lugansk forces continue offensive actions, while the troops of the Donetsk Republic have established control over a few settlements on the border previously under Kiev's control. Moscow has also stated that Russian armed forces continue to strike at the objects of the military infrastructure of Ukraine. Now let's take a look then at a Ukrainian military base in the Kherson region, which Russian forces have taken control of. Abandoned tanks, cars, armoured personnel carriages and equipment which servicemen left behind while retreating can all be seen. Our senior correspondent Murad Gazdiev is there.
We're now at a Ukrainian military base in the province of Kherson. This base was abandoned very quickly by Ukrainian troops. There wasn't much of a fight here. They left their equipment. These are, for example, T-64 tanks, all of them in working order. They're now being evacuated from here by the Russian military, which has taken over. Where they're being taken, we haven't been told, but again, these are tanks all in working order. Over there's an arsenal, so small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, vast quantities of ammunition also left behind. You can see armored personnel carriers, as well as all manner of trucks that have been left here. Where all these Ukrainian troops have gone is something that nobody knows. They may have mingled with the civilian population or moved further west towards where the front lines are and where certain Ukrainian elements of their military are still putting up a fight. And this is a vast Ukrainian military field camp that was abandoned by the troops here. From what we've been told, there were 3,000 to 4,000 Ukrainian servicemen stationed here. None were left by the time the Russian military arrived. As you can tell, they left in a tremendous hurry. All over the place are personal documents, IDs of Ukrainian troops. Also, military uniforms. Apparently the soldiers here shook off these, left them here, and put on civilian clothing before mingling with civilians in the city or in various villages nearby. This, as I say, a scene of absolute chaos. Personal items are everywhere. We have also been told that the troops here were abandoned by their own leadership, that they weren't made aware that Russian forces were advancing, and they only learned this from news reports and from conversations with locals. Again, this place is absolutely vast. These tents, rows and rows of tents, stretch for hundreds of meters. Here's also a huge ammunition dump of the Ukrainian military. There are crates packed with various ammunition, explosives all over the place. 122 millimeter mines, mortar rounds, a tank shell along with the charge, for example. In this protected depot are even more explosives. For example, guided missile canisters, rows and rows of them, as well as here you have the explosive heads, the detonators for mines. Over in these crates, 80 millimeter mortar rounds. And again, this stretches into the distance, crates and crates of various bullets, mines, and much more. It isn't safe here. It is believed that at least the ammunition dumps, that they are mined, that there are booby traps and explosives. A surprise for Russian troops.
President Zelensky has again asked NATO to provide combat aircraft and close the sky above Ukraine. However, NATO countries seem not to be too keen on that idea, as they fear it could elevate the conflict to a nuclear level.
Світ має силу, щоб закрити наші...
The world has the power to close our sky from Russian missiles, from Russian combat aircraft, helicopters. If anyone still doubts, Ukraine needs planes. In fact, it's simple. When you have the will to make the sky safe.
This is not a NATO conflict, and it will not become one. No ally has sent combat troops to Ukraine. We have no hostility toward the Russian people, and we have no desire to impugn a great nation and a world power.
The European Union is definitely not at war with Russia. European funds will not be used to finance the delivery of combat aircraft to Ukraine.
Meanwhile, Russia's president has highlighted to his Turkish counterpart that the operation in Ukraine will end as soon as Kiev stops fighting. He told Recep Erdogan that Moscow's terms must be met and any efforts to stall negotiations will lead to nothing. President Erdogan has stated that Turkey will do everything it can to help resolve the conflict. Now, for more on this, let's go live to Yunus Sona, a political scientist and former deputy chairman of the Turkish Vatan Party. Welcome to RT International.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Now, the UK PM Boris Johnson said earlier that the conflict in Ukraine is not NATO's fight. How accurate do you believe that statement to be, especially given that many NATO countries have pumped hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid into Ukraine?
I think we can interpret this message of Johnson as a small acknowledgement of defeat, that he was not able to pull the European allies back behind his position to further escalating the conflict in Ukraine. And do not forget, there is serious fractions within the European countries and between European countries and Britain in that matter as well. Just remember the conflicts that led to the fact of Brexit, and just remember, for instance, currently that heading towards presidential elections, all French candidates, presidential candidates, to different degrees, announced a distancing from NATO. So I think Johnson's statement is an acknowledgement that there is no consensus in the Western camp towards further escalating the conflict.
Well, and talking of consensus, Turkey finds itself in an unusual position at the moment, being a NATO member, but it also has very close ties with Russia. Can you tell me more about that, please?
Well, I think Turkey needs here to focus on its own national security interests. That means focusing on the fact that we have lived here in Turkey through 3 different coup d'etats organized by the United States and its NATO allies in 1971, in 1980, and lastly in 2016. Turkey faces NATO-supported ethnic separatist organization PKK in the north of Syria. Turkey faces NATO exercises along its shores in the eastern Mediterranean. So Turkey, I think, is forced to acknowledge that a further expansion of NATO towards the east of Europe is also not only circling Russia, but it's also a measure of circling Turkey. So I think this is slowly but surely gaining ground in Turkish politics as well. We have observed that recently the coalition partner, if you will, of the governing AKP, the Party of National Action, their chairman stated that though rejecting the Russian invasion in Ukraine, they also rejected the expansion of NATO towards Eastern Europe. So I think this is the point where Turkey should focus on it. It is a contradictory situation for us, being a NATO member, but being a NATO member, we have been threatened by NATO for the last 50 years, including with NATO allies supporting terror organizations inside Turkey and along Turkey's borders. So slowly but surely, I think this observation will gain ground in Turkish politics, and it should so.
Now, President Putin and the Turkish leader Erdogan, they had a phone call earlier about the situation in Ukraine. How much common ground do you think the leaders share in terms of resolving the conflict, and what role do you think the Turkish leader can play in that?
I think the Turkish government can play a very positive role if it focuses on its own, as I mentioned, national security interests. This is not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. This is a conflict between NATO expanding towards what I would call Eurasian countries. Currently, it's Russia, but tomorrow it will be Turkey. And it has been yesterday, actually, Turkey as well. As I mentioned, we had a coup d'etat here in 2016, supported by NATO forces inside Turkey as well. So if the Turkish government focuses on that broader scope, and if it acknowledges that the conflict in Ukraine is a conflict between NATO, led by the United States, and the Eurasian side, currently led by Russia, but with China and India and several Latin American countries behind it, then it will play a positive role in not only pushing back NATO, but also in really achieving or contributing to regional and global peace. I think that is the path to follow. And this scope needs to go beyond small and short-term economic interests as well. This is very important.
Well, talking about economic interests and sanctions and the whole policy situation, the Kremlin said that the Turkish leader did criticize the discrimination Russians are now facing in the West. As we've heard, MasterCard and Visa have withdrawn, and now many Russians will struggle to access their cash. They're also facing discrimination because of the Ukrainian conflict. How serious a problem do you think this is?
I think this is really a serious problem. Let us listen to what US President Biden recently said in his State of the Union, where he, I quote, said that the free world has been shaken. Well, free world in that context means the world free to join NATO and to accept US dominance within the alliance. So he's defending actually Ukrainian government's freedom to submit itself to NATO control and dominance. So this is a serious conflict, and we are facing, concerning the sanctions, the U.S. claim of the so-called unipolar world. They are trying hard to organize this unipolar world. They are trying hard to organize it in security, in energy. They are intervening into global energy markets. They are trying to force everyone to sell strategic reserves of oil, for instance. And they are trying to keep up the system going under their dominance and guidance. And we can simply measure their success by taking a look at the oil price or the gas price. They fail in that. So this is a reflection that sanctions are failing as well. And I think this is a profound conflict. It goes well beyond Ukraine. This is very important to acknowledge that this conflict is about U.S. global dominance. And it's very contested right now, currently in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world as well.
Well, Yunus Sona, political scientist and former deputy chairman of the Turkish Vatan Party, thank you very much for sharing your opinions on the Ukraine conflict at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dozens of Russian-speaking German residents have demonstrated in Berlin against discrimination they say they're facing over the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Now, they gathered in front of Berlin's Brandenburg Gate to highlight abuse suffered by their children, many of whom have now become the subject of attacks for their Russian background. Earlier, OncoAlert, a worldwide network of oncology professionals, announced it's ending cooperation with Russia. Now, some other medical organizations around the world have also followed suit.
Due to the serious violation of international law by the obviously mentally disturbed autocrat Putin, we refuse to treat Russian patients with immediate effect. Ukrainian patients are of course welcome.
The organization later apologized, saying it will continue treating Russians. Irina Yudina, who helps Russian-speaking patients receive medical services in Germany, says the email left her terrified.
Suddenly, I received a letter from a professor of genetics at the university clinic with whom we just recently treated a child's genetic abnormalities, which said that they will no longer accept Russian patients, but welcome Ukrainians. The next day, the letter got picked up on social media here in Germany. Its general meaning is that the terrible Putin started this operation, and this is unacceptable to anyone. But you see, we don't belong to any military operations. We treat people. But nevertheless, I started to receive comments, threats, calling us fascists. I'm terrified. I have a lot of patients who constantly come and take medicine. We can't even change companies. A person reacts differently to drugs. They're left without medicines. We cross out all work for decades. We will fight because most people in Germany do not support this. For them, it's unacceptable to divide according to nationality and depending on this to treat. This should not be because of any Russian operations. Humanitarian values should not be linked to politics.
And as dramatic scenes in Ukraine continue to unfold, many people are trying to understand why all this is happening and what led to such an escalation. RT's Paula Slier has an explainer of the roots of the conflict and why many media reports fail to take the entire picture into consideration.
I am angry at this evil act by this evil leader attacking an innocent nation, a democratic nation.
He wasn't just threatening Ukraine, that significant enough, but he seemed to be challenging the post-Cold War order.
The mainstream media narrative is self-evident. You could be forgiven for thinking that this conflict began last week. But the timeline leading to this conflict is longer. In the short term, Western states weaponized Ukraine on Russian borders, explaining it as a response to Russian military maneuvers on its own territory.
NATO has started military technical exploration of Ukraine now. It's not possible for us to swallow. You said that there is no space for us to retreat. There is just only a Russian Federation.
Moscow's requests for security guarantees from the US and NATO were numerous. Their concerns seemed reasonable at the very least, halting the military alliance's relentless expansion to Russian borders and the deployment of missile systems and other military infrastructure in the region. The requests fell on deaf ears.
NATO moves its forces to our state borders, while we, strictly fulfilling the agreement, do not react to these actions in any way. I think it's clear that NATO's enlargement process has nothing to do with modernizing its alliance or ensuring security in Europe. It is precisely these central concerns of ours that were unfortunately ignored in the responses received on January the 26th from the United States and NATO.
In the absence of the readiness of the American side to agree on firm, legally binding guarantees of ensuring our security by the United States and its allies, Russia will be forced to respond, including through the implementation of military technical measures.
Washington was adamant in its firm support of NATO's open-door policy, even though the apparently defensive alliance was from the very outset aimed against Russia, back then the USSR.
So if Kremlin's aim is to have less NATO on its borders, it will only get more NATO.
This appeared to be a 180-degree turnaround of former agreements. Here's a map of NATO members in 1990 and in 2022. So the promises were broken, not once, not twice, but 14 times. That's how many countries have become NATO members since the 90s. Yet now, NATO and co., cheered on by the mainstream media, pretend like there were no promises at all.
I would like to state once again that neither the 2+4 agreement nor the NATO-Russia Founding Act contained promises to Russia that NATO would not expand to the east. The 2+4 agreement does not mention this issue at all, and any statements to the contrary do not correspond to reality.
Where is that written down? Where is that promise written down?
It's actually right here, the minutes of a March 6, 1991 meeting in Bonn between political directors of the foreign ministries of the US, UK, France and Germany.
We had made it clear during the 2+4 negotiations that we would not extend NATO beyond the Elbe. We could not therefore offer Poland and others membership in NATO.
Is it any surprise then that Moscow has become distrustful? All it wanted was a document with legally binding security guarantees, but it seems that the West was never interested in this. The same way it was never interested in keeping its promises to force Ukraine to implement the Minsk Accords. Kiev pledged decentralizing reforms to provide broad autonomy to the eastern regions that declared independence in 2014. Instead, Kiev launched what it called an anti-terrorist operation in the breakaway republics. The fact that over 14,000 people were killed in the Donbass since 2014 didn't seem to concern or to be noticed by the international community. The West also closed its eyes to the fact that many of the volunteer battalions accompanying the Ukrainian military in their fight against the rebels had nationalist backgrounds. After years of stalemate and suffering, the Donbas republics requested Russia's help in putting an end to what they perceived as Ukrainian military aggression. Russia sees their military operation as a defense of these people. Of course, the Western narrative is one of aggression, despite their own military interventions in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan and Serbia, to name just a few.
As US outlets cover Russia's attack on Ukraine, remember how these same outlets cover US attacks. When the US bombed Syria in 2017, MSNBC's Brian Williams called the footage of the strike beautiful. He then quoted Leonard Cohen, "I am guided by the beauty of our weapons." CNN's Fareed Zakaria was similarly enthusiastic about Trump's attack on Syria. "I think Donald Trump became president of the United States last night. He talked about international norms, international rules, about America's role in enforcing justice in the world."
All of us, including the Iraqi people, are going to be very fortunate.
I think it was the smartest thing George Bush did.
Why would we intervene in Libya? Because it'd be the right thing to do. Because people are dying for altruistic reasons.
This is, as I say, a consequence of a consistent pattern of violations of international law by us, by the United States, and by NATO. I think that it would have been super easy for the Western powers to accept that the best solution would be to have a declaration of neutrality for Ukraine, and then Ukraine could have the best relations, commercial and otherwise, with the West and with the East. But we have here a problem of an information war in which the level of lying, the level of fake news and fake history and fake law has reached such points that people cannot talk to each other.
Among the sanctions imposed on Russia are those affecting the automotive industry, with many companies subsequently forced to halt imports and production. BMW, Volkswagen and Mercedes are among those who have announced production cuts due to a lack of parts and materials. There are also worries that global electric vehicle production will be affected as large amounts of nickel used to make batteries comes from Russia. And the European job sector is also vulnerable, with an estimated 250,000 German jobs alone depending on Russian car parts exports. Well, for more on this, we can go live now to Richard Werner, Professor of Banking and Finance at De Montfort University. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the car manufacturing sector is clearly a huge employer and a big moneymaker in Europe. What impact do you think these sanctions are having back in the EU, the ones that have been imposed on Russia?
Yes, well, the impact is significant. It is very, very large. Germany, of course, Europe's largest economy, is actually particularly badly affected as it is now hitting very directly the automobile industry. Before we already have seen the development of the emerging energy crisis, and that even that, of course, is also still going to get much worse. And you need energy to run your industry. Germany has been relying on Russia and should have adopted a more consistent policy and not shut Russia out when it's quite clear that it needs this energy. But now the automobile industry is coming to a standstill. In the coming week, we will see major manufacturers, Volkswagen, BMW, stopping production in BMW in their key factories in Munich, in Dingolfing, in Leipzig and Steyr in Austria as well, and more to come as it looks, because these manufacturers, also Volkswagen, have been relying on some key components from factories in the Ukraine, and somehow they hadn't put one and one together. You know, if you're doing that and you're also relying on Russian energy, well, why don't you insist on a more balanced European policy towards Russia and Ukraine that doesn't aim at causing conflict? And so the conflict is now here. And supply lines are being cut. This is going to have a dramatic impact.
Apologies for interrupting. With these severing of supply lines, what impact do you think that will have on already inflated car prices?
Exactly. I mean, we will see further rises in car prices. We're seeing the energy prices going ballistic, and actually the other area that's also going to be very painful and even scarier, if you want, is the food supplies, because also grain exports are being halted. There's now some Eastern European countries saying, okay, we're going to stop exporting because it looks like we're going to have a food shortage. Ukraine and also Russia produce a lot of grain, and that could really cause an even bigger crisis. So we have industry affected, corporate profits, and that's just a start. There is unlikely to be layoffs, unemployment. Germany avoided a recession in the 2008 so-called global financial crisis entirely, and there was no unemployment increase. So it's going to be a big shock now. And the question is, why is Europe really insisting on this pain and on these supply restrictions?
Well, I guess time will tell just how deeply those sanctions will cut into both economies. Richard Werner, Professor of Banking and Finance at De Montfort University, thank you very much for your input today.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, Moscow motorists decided to show their support for Russian troops in Ukraine. Drivers at a pre-organized rally decorated their cars with the letters Z and V, insignia Russian soldiers use on their armored vehicles. The letters, meaning victory and support, have become everyday symbols of Russia's ongoing military operation. Similar campaigns are taking place across the country. And just before we go, a word on how you can watch RT at the moment around the world, because there's been a few questions about that. All the ways you can find us are laid out at rt.com/where-to-watch, including how to tune your satellite receiver to reach our signal. We're available in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere across the globe that way. Do head over to our website for the full list and lowdown. Well, that's a wrap for this hour. My name's Peter Scott, and I'll be back again with more news and, of course, any developments in the ongoing Ukraine conflict at the top of the hour.